When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Greyjoy Rebellion. We're going to be talking about what caused it, the events surrounding it, everything about it, and a little bit of its maybe impact on the actual normal story as well, as it actually has a pretty huge influence. We see characters like Theon ending up with the Starks, and there's just a bunch of the stuff that we could really look at. So, we're going to start out today's video with another kind of AI-generated quote. Let me know how you guys think about this. But who else better to describe the Greyjoy Rebellion than Cersei's inner thoughts?
Robert should have scoured the Isles after Balon Greyjoy rose against him. He smashed their fleet, burned their towns, and broke their castles. But when he had them on their knees, he let them up again. He should have made another island of their skulls.
Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed that quote. And I think that's an interesting topic that we'll talk about at the end of the video when I get towards the kind of conclusion of the Greyjoy Rebellion. What do you guys think should have actually happened at the end? What ends up really happening is Balon reluctantly bends the knee and Robert kind of leaves. There's not really like a ton of repercussions. Theon is sent to Ned to make sure Balon has good behavior. That's it. That's all that really happens. And we know that really doesn't really work because Balon was planning on rebelling regardless later on after Robert dies. What was your guys's? How would you have handled it? Would you have gone the Cersei route and killed them all? What would you have done? But let's get into kind of the events surrounding and the build up to the Greyjoy Rebellion. But before we do, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach out to people that might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. Also, if you guys did not see my reread on Tuesday, I just want to say, if you're wondering where I was the last week, I was sick basically for Monday of last week after stream to Monday this week. So that's why I was kind of gone for that period of time. But yeah, we're back now. So hopefully, you know, we stay not sick for a while. But to start out with where we need to talk about this topic is we kind of need to go back to Robert's Rebellion. I want to look at what did the Greyjoys do during this time period, who was in charge, what was kind of the trend or the ideology they were at this point. So a video I've kind of been wanting to do is on Quellon Greyjoy. Quellon Greyjoy was the Lord at this time. I think he's one of the best Greyjoys, so one of the most progressive that would have helped the Greyjoys kind of come into Westeros a bit more, because at this point the Iron Islands feel like they're their own kind of thing. Like, they don't really have the same religion as Westeros, they don't have the same ethics as Westeros, they have their own different culture that kind of hurts them when it comes to things like trade and things like that. But Quellon Greyjoy, he is someone that had the ideology of securing ties with Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms and just growing closer to them as a whole. But for the most part, the Greyjoys had stayed neutral until after the Battle of the Trident. They were very similar to the Lannisters, which in my opinion was really smart. They basically did the same idea, just as the Lannisters, they just did it in a much more minor scale. Now, this led to the Greyjoys joining Robert's side, but unfortunately, Quellon died on the Mander, so they go to basically attack a little bit, just to kind of show that they are on Robert's side, and unfortunately, Quellon dies. How different the world could have been for especially the Greyjoys if Quellon had lived. And Quellon, for you guys that don't know, this is the father of Balon and Victarion and Euron and Aeron. He is the father. So he would have been someone that, for as long as he was in power, could have done a lot of good. And the really rough part about this is that he dies in a battle that was very meaningless. It didn't mean anything really outside of just getting the Greyjoys a little bit more favor with Robert. But this is going to let his son Balon Greyjoy take power. Now, what I think is interesting is we go from one of the smartest Greyjoys, in my opinion, to one of the dumbest. Now, Balon was not like his father at all. We hear all of these stories, or we see all these characters in the main story where they're very much like their parents, right? Robb is a lot like Ned. We see Jon is like Ned. We see Cersei trying to be like Tywin. We see all of the Lannister children trying to be like Tywin. that was not really the case whatsoever for Quelon's children. Like, none of Quelon's children really seem like him at all. Quelon, I would say, is very similar to a character like Asha. Asha kind of has a lot of the same ideologies as Quelon, and I think that could be something that we could see foreshadowed, that Asha is going to be the guy that, Asha is going to be the person that kind of takes on Quelon's legacy and is the one that could actually get the Greyjoys into a good spot. But at this point, Balon wanted to reject all of these reforms that Quelon had been making. He desired independence. And something else to consider here is that the old way believes in taking and earning what is yours, not making trades and being given stuff. So again, this is kind of the reason that Balon does not accept like this idea of Robb giving him a crown, more or less. Balon is trying to basically revert this. He's going more into, in my opinion, it's kind of like isolationism. You're not trading with the Seven Kingdoms. You're taking, you're stealing, you're reaving. That is not a great outlook. Because, again, the Iron Islands do not have the resources to stand against the kingdoms, right? And so what ends up happening is I kind of labeled this like the pre-Greyjoy Rebellion era after Robert's Rebellion. Balon starts a period of preparation to war. He builds a new fleet of 100 war galleys. And I really want to just hammer this in the nail. That the Greyjoys by themselves, it is very difficult for them to really gain any type of independence. And we're going to talk about when we get into the Greyjoy Rebellion how the Greyjoys could have won the war. But again, it's very difficult. So again, to build upon this, the Greyjoys had joined Robert's Rebellion late. So they suffered very few losses. They were in great condition. It's kind of like the Tyrells after the War of the Five Kings. They hadn't really lost much. They kind of sat back and came in at the end and they were on top. So this added to their confidence, or I guess Balon's confidence specifically for independence. Again, very similar to House Frey in another way of looking at it, how they stayed kind of neutral and they've kind of stayed out of it. Balon held the belief that Robert's reign was not very secure and he would not have the support of the major houses. We know he was obviously wrong. Now, I'm trying to understand, this is something I looked at in my notes, like, what was Balon thinking? Why did he feel like Robert's reign was not very secure? So the first part of that would be, well, Dorne didn't really like Robert. We know that there were some issues there. So maybe you could have pointed to, okay, didn't have Dorne on his side. Maybe you could point to, okay, Ned and Robert had a kind of a fractured relationship. Again, we see how Ned was not very happy with the Lannisters and Robert was kind of okay with it. That kind of put a wedge between the two, but then we know that they reconciled after Lyanna's death. So maybe Balon just didn't know that information. Maybe Balon just thought that, okay, the North and the Stormlands or Robert were not in a good point. So maybe he thought, okay, the North wouldn't bother with this southern conflict. Even then, right, you still had the Vale, Jon Arryn being the hand of the king. Jon Arryn was married to the Tullys, so you would assume the Tullys would then get in the war, which kind of would then drag the North into the war. You had the Lannisters who were married to Robert, so you know Tywin was going to deal with that issue. So they were kind of banking on, I guess, in a perfect scenario, I think they were banking on, okay, well, Tyrells wouldn't join, they were for the Targaryens, the Dorne wouldn't join, and then also maybe the North wouldn't join, so maybe they thought, okay, if we're only going against the Lannisters, maybe the Crownlands and like the Vale, we'd be okay. Didn't turn out that way. And that's best case scenario. So again, just really bad planning by Balon, in my opinion. And even Balon, he had people around him that weren't afraid to tell him that this was stupid, right? Where we see a lot of people like, say, the Mad King, he didn't have people around him that would tell him no. Or even someone like Maegor. But Roderick Harlaw, the Lord of Harlaw, tried to convince Balon not to rebel. But he was disregarded, as Balon, only 6 years after the Targaryens had fallen, in 289 AC, he was crowned the King of the Iron Islands with the Driftwood Crown. So, let's get into the Greyjoy Rebellion. What was the Greyjoys' strategy? What were they trying to do? Well, in my opinion, if we look at the map of A Song of Ice and Fire, or Westeros, it's pretty clear to see what they were trying to do. Balon and Victarion and Euron, they were trying to fully take advantage of the western sea of Westeros. They wanted to completely control that. They wanted to make it to where, okay, if you're going to invade the Iron Islands, how are you going to have ships do that? How are you going to get a force from Westeros, mainland Westeros, to the Iron Islands? So Balon, what he does is he thinks, okay, let's get rid of, again, the major ports. So Lannisport, Seaguard. Let's try to get rid of all of these places that are the biggest threats to us at this point. It's a very similar strategy to the Japanese in World War II with America. The Ironborn were definitely outnumbered. They had the less resources. All of those things apply to Japan in World War II. America was like the sleeping giant. And the Ironborn woke the sleeping giant of Robert, who thrived in war. So you have this idea. And it's not a bad strategy in theory. And talking about what maybe could have been going on with Balon's head on Robert's reign, like we talked about earlier, you can maybe see how this had a chance of working. And maybe it could have if some things had gone differently. So there are two major points they attacked. I just mentioned them both briefly, but they attack at Seaguard and Lannisport. Another thing I think is lacking in Balon's rationale is the idea that, you have other fleets. Like, these aren't the only two fleets. Yes, it would take much longer. And maybe the idea here was that Balon thought that if the Iron Islands was such a pain in the ass and they kind of took out the Western fleets, that Robert would roll over. That he would be like, okay, this is just too much of an annoyance. I'm just going to let it go and they can have their independence. And they could not have been more wrong on Robert's personality. If they had done this when, say, Aenys, the second Targaryen king, was king, this would have worked beautifully. If they had done this when Tommen was king and maybe he had bad people under him, maybe this would have worked. But under Robert, who is very much a warlike king that would not stand for this, the strategy just is not a good one. People loved Robert. And Robert loved war. So you kind of know where this is going. But talking about the individual battles of Seaguard and Lannisport, Lannisport is this whole plan that's made by Euron and how to surprise strike them. And Victarion's kind of the one that carried it out. The raid was very successful. Again, it was a surprise attack. It more or less took out a lot of the Lannister fleet. This was a fantastic way to start out the war. It was very much like Pearl Harbor for the Japanese on the United States. Very similar situation. Surprise attack type situation. Takes kind of the fleet out of one of the major powers. And again, is a major victory. And so let's transition to the other side of the war, which was Seaguard at this point. This is the home of the Mallisters. And this raid was not good. It went terrible. Roderick, who was Balon's son, and the Ironborn were thrown back into the sea. So a major blow. So even the first step of the plan failed. If they had taken Seaguard and neutralized the Mallisters and a lot of the Riverlands, like, fleet in that area, okay, now that's a different discussion. But you failed. You couldn't fail at this battle and really win this war. At that point, this is the point. In my opinion, when they lose Seaguard, that was their best chance of maybe neutralizing the western side so that they can completely deal with this fleet from Stannis coming up from the southern tip of Westeros. That was a major turning point if you are the Roberts, if you are loyal to Robert and all of that force. And another point I wanted to bring up, right? So Balon had this idea that Robert's reign was very, the major houses wouldn't support him. And I talked about the Riverlands maybe being one of those houses where you could say maybe he had just banked on Hoster Tully wouldn't help. He then proceeds to attack the Tullys. He attacks the Tullys and the Lannisters on the same beginning strategy. So not only does he piss off Robert and the Baratheons, but he now also, right off the bat, has the Lannisters and the Tullys pissed off at him, which kind of drags in the Starks. It drags in the Vale as well. The Vale was going to help anyway, because Jon Arryn is the hand. It's just, there's some reasoning here that did not work, and you can see obviously why everyone gets involved and then just spanks Balon. So that gets us into the second part of this. So it's more about Robert's response. We see what Balon's initial strategy was. We see how it was semi-efficient, but not fully. And that leads us to Robert's response. Robert had not been idle. He hears this, and Stannis right away, as master of ships, joined up with the royal fleet and headed to the southern tip of Westeros to meet up with the fleets of the Red Wines and the Old Town fleets as well. So, like I talked about, this is not the only fleets that the Ironborn needed to worry about. It was the closest ones. It was the best ones for if Robert was just going to immediately go and siege the Iron Islands. It was the best ones to get rid of, but it was not the only ones. And I won't sit here and say Balon didn't know that, because Balon knew those fleets were coming up, right? Victarion goes to take them out. And with that, Stannis, who again is the GOAT military commander, sets a trap and catches Victarion on the Straits of Fair Isle. Again, they kind of get trapped in, and it destroys their fleet. And now this is the big problem. Because the one thing shielding the Iron Islands from a raid or from being sieged was their fleet. If you couldn't cross to the Iron Islands, you couldn't attack them. Again, very similar to Japan, right? So when the Americans in World War II were trying to beat the Japanese, they had to slowly take over all of these islands to get them closer to Japan to be able to bomb them, to launch an attack on mainland Japan. Very similar to this idea of, again, conquering kind of the sea or the rivers, and again, taking the fight to the Ironborn. It's kind of the same idea if you want to look at Hitler invading the UK. Germany could not take control of the water, so he couldn't mount a siege on them. And that was kind of the big point. That's what we're kind of talking about here, is that Stannis beating Victarion here allows what Robert does. And Robert's going to get all the glory, and Stannis is not really going to get any. And Stannis is the one that allows it to happen. Because this war, if it was like a cat and mouse game where you kind of have with Euron right now in the main story and how he'll be in Winds of Winter, where he's attacking here and then he's somewhere else, this war could have gone on for much, much longer. Because Stannis needed to have sea superiority before they could invade the Iron Islands. Something also to note here is that Aeron Greyjoy was caught, and he actually remained in the Casterly Rock dungeon for the rest of the war. So just something else that's interesting that comes off of this battle. And with Balon's fleet neutralized, all that remained was to attack the Iron Islands. Robert was supported by the fleets of the south, and mainly by Ned Stark and Tywin Lannister and their forces. Stannis, leading his forces, landed on the Great Wyke and took them in Robert's name, while Barristan led forces to the Old Wyke and took it as well. Harlaw and Orkmont were also invaded this time, leaving Pike itself as the final destination of the war. And that leads us to the Siege of Pike and the aftermath. To start with, the Boltley Castle was completely destroyed, as was the town of Lord's Porch beneath it, just to set the stage, and I guess the brutalness of war. Ned and Robert then began to have siege engines attack the southern wall, shattering the biggest parts of the main watchtower and bringing parts of the wall down. Aeron Greyjoy, Balon's second son, dies at this point as well. Thoros was the first into the breach with his wildfire sword, with Jorah and Jacqueline Bywater not far behind. The fighting was intense, but eventually Balon was brought in chains to Robert. Balon was forced to swear fealty to him, and his last remaining son, Theon, was to be fostered with Ned to ensure his good behavior. And that's the end of the war. So again, what are our major side effects? Well, for now, it seems like the Greyjoys are out of the question, right? They've been neutered. They aren't a big threat for the rest of Robert's reign for a lot of reasons, because I think Balon was afraid of Robert and Ned and all of these people, and that's why he waited till after these people die to start another rebellion. I don't think Balon actually gave two shits about Theon. Theon was so young that he was barely like there in the Iron Islands, that after so many years of being with Ned, I just don't believe Balon even viewed Theon as a son. I don't think he really gave a shit about him. And Balon, that's just him being a stupid idiot. But there's a lot that comes from this. You know, we see Victarion's prowess. You know, he does get caught by Stannis, but he's a great commander, in my opinion. Euron, we see his strategy. A lot comes from the Greyjoy Rebellion that's not exactly talked about a ton. And I think this all comes down to being a tragedy. I think if Quelon Greyjoy had ruled for longer, maybe he could have gotten his customs in, better power and standing. And maybe that could have been enough, showing the Greyjoy people what came from that and how they would be better. Because when Quelon dies, it kind of feels like people were glad to kind of go back to the old ways that Balon was introducing. But yeah, this kind of feels like something we could see come up with Winds of Winter, with Asha's character specifically. I think Quelon and Asha just have a lot of similarities to me. And yeah, thank you guys all for watching this video. I hope you guys all enjoyed me talking about the Greyjoy Rebellion. Also, let me know if you guys want me to do a more in-depth video on Quelon Greyjoy. I'd love to do one, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.